Thanks everyone for coming and spending the afternoon here listening to me talk about installing and configuring Artifactory using chef recipes. When I was asked, or when I proposed this talk, JFrog wanted me to highlight something new in Artifactory 5, and that's Chef Supermarket. So I've set up a demo here that will illustrate that, and we'll get to that in a little bit. A little bit about myself. I'm a software engineer at Yahoo. It was about a year and a half or a little bit more. I got involved with Artifactory, working on some plugins to clean up some storage space that we had. And I had to enhance them, and I pushed those back to the open source community. And after that, my next task was to migrate from Artifactory 3.x to 4.x. And in that time, Chef was becoming very important in Yahoo infrastructure. And so the idea was to break apart all of our internal packaging and deployment stuff and use Chef. So I developed recipes to do that, and that's what I'm going to be covering some of it and demoing some of that capability. So the motivation for doing rewriting all this and doing Chef was that we really wanted to, well, it's the overview. I'll talk about the motivation, a little bit of the Chef concepts. This isn't a Chef class per se, but just to talk about it. And then this cookbook that I put together. Our original one tied together Yahoo-ish kinds of things and Artifactory, strictly Artifactory stuff. And I broke it out for this demo, and I call it Frogger to be in with the JFrog. And then I have a demo, and then there's a QA afterwards if there's any questions. So the motivation for doing this is the typical continuous delivery goals of you want to be able to limit human intervention in deploying software. You want to reduce human error. You want to make it repeatable. This thing we want to be able to do as many times as we want to and in as many days or hours that we want to do this. So it's got to be right, and it's got to be repeatable. And we were successful with it. Chef also allows us to version our changes. So this whole idea of configuration of as code goes along that way. Anything that we want to change is code. It has to be reviewed and versioned. So if we want to go back to a particular version, we can recall that and do that. So just a little bit about Chef for those who don't know about it, or vaguely about it. Chef is a client-server model. Definitions are typically on the server. The nodes that are under control of Chef get the information for what it is supposed to do, and it's sent to the client daemon that's running on the nodes, and it performs the operations of what it was intended to do. Chef has a concept of idempotence, meaning that if you run this thing multiple times, what you get out of it is the same thing each time. It's not going to change things. So you write your recipes to the point where that, you know, they don't continuously change things, or they don't add stuff to a file and keep adding the same thing over and over again. Convergence is the concept of Chef looks at what the node is, looks at what the server says it should be, and brings it into compliance. That's either by doing the actions that are in the recipe, and then, you know, or if it hasn't changed, it just doesn't do it with the idempotence concept. So convergence will bring your node into compliance with what you've set it up for. So here's some terminology with some examples. Chef has the organization. Organization, you can look like, you can form it as like a subsystem or a system. In this case, at Yahoo even, we have an organization, Artifactory. So everything related to Artifactory and all our instances of it belong under this organization. The organization is a collection of nodes, environment definitions, role definitions, cookbooks and recipes, run lists, and all that. A node is basically a server that you have out there. You bootstrap that node into Chef, and now Chef knows about that node. It associates it with the organization. You assign a node an environment. Environment here, examples like production, or you have a staging, or you have a development, or whatever you deem as necessary. Roles, we typically look at it as functionality in the role. We run a high availability cluster where we have, and we also have a disaster recovery system. So the primary master is a role. It means something special in the recipe, like making sure that it's designated as the high availability primary. Secondary has other semantics to it, but that's what a role is intended for. We tend to use roles also to distinguish between locations. A node can only have one environment, but so we have like East Coast, West Coast, Central, or wherever else. Those are roles, and those might have special definitions. For example, we have like a load balancer in the different geographies. So the definition of that load balancer, where it is and all that, is assigned to a role, and that role is assigned to the node or nodes that make up that cluster. Attribute, that's one of the key things I find in Chef that's useful. An attribute is a key value pair that is used to, in this case, drive the whole recipe, but it takes constants out of your recipe, allows you to override those from different definitions. You can have a default attribute. You may reassign that depending on the environment you're in or a role you're in. So you can have, like I said, a default set and then vary that based on those other environments or roles. Cookbook is a collection of your definition of your attributes, the recipes, helper functions, spec files that basically unit test your recipes. And then the recipe itself is, recipes are written in Ruby. They're chunks of code that do the actions that you want to do. Runlist. Runlist is a designation for a node that this is the action that's going to happen when it converges. You can use a default run list that does nothing, or it can do something. We typically don't do anything because we don't continuously converge. But when we want to deploy, we set the run list to run the code that will install Artifactory or upgrade Artifactory or whatever. And then we set the run list, run it, and then set it back. So in this example, and what I'm going to be demoing, Frogger is the name of the cookbook, and example Artifactory source is one recipe that I have, and I'll explain that when I get to the demo. Resources, your Ruby code that's part of your recipes, they consist of blocks of resources. Resources are like, think of them as function calls. You can call a resource a directory to ensure that when your node is converged, that directory exists. That directory exists, it has certain ownership and it has certain permissions. Files are files that could be in the cookbook that are transferred to the node and placed, or there's things like services. Services are, Artifactory happens to be a service, so it gets installed in init.d directory and it gets registered as a service, so you can call it with service start and service stop and things like that. And there's many other. All this stuff, documentation for Chef is on the web, and that's pretty much how I wrote it. I didn't really look at other recipes that much. Just go out there and find out what you want to do and write it up. Another key thing that I like about Chef is the template. So it's basically, you take a file and you put it what you want, and then you substitute in almost like a JSP syntax where you can mark, where you can substitute values in on a convergence time. So these things are called between the less than percent equals, those would be variables, or they could be attributes that get substituted into this file, and then this file is placed on the file system. So the example here is Artifactory has a logger file, and one of the things my recipe does is it installs plugins, and I also update the logback.xml to enable logging for each of the plugins that I put in here. So this is a dynamically generated thing, and then it goes and adds this XML to that logback.xml. Knife is another really cool facility of Chef. The example here is I have a collection of nodes that belong to the Chef environment production here, and I can run the same command on all those at once. I do a knife SSH. The other thing is a search parameter, so Chef will go out and find all the nodes, and then it'll execute the command that I give on each of those nodes and give the results back to me. It turns out you can actually even do sudo commands. If you prefix your command with sudo, Knife will prompt you locally, you give your password, it then gives it safely to each of those nodes, and so you can run sudo on each of those as well. Test Kitchen, this is probably the coolest thing that I've seen. It's an environment to test everything in a VM. So Test Kitchen is, on a Mac uses Vagrant and VirtualBox, and it basically, when you give it the commands like I have here, kitchen create, it will look for the definition for that in a kitchen.yaml file, and it will provision a virtual machine, set it up, loading the image that I want. In this demo, I took a CentOS image, and it installs that and applies everything you need, and the create will just create the virtual machine and be done. It'll create a SSH link that you can SSH in from your host into the virtual machine as well. The kitchen converge will actually do what a normal Chef converge will do. It'll run what's in the run list. And I'll show that later. And the kitchen destroy basically removes the VM. So those are just some of the things here. So now on to the cookbook that I developed. I made it very simple. It does a simple install and configure and a start and stop. Those are basically 3 functions you call, and that's it. Everything else is data-driven. Everything. Everything's in a attribute definition. And I believe I'll show some later. For example, where the JVM is located at its home location, whether you're doing a standalone or high availability Artifactory installation. If you're doing SSL, what are the SSL certs, where they are in our environment. In this kitchen environment, they would be data bags in the cookbook. They get downloaded into the virtual machine. The recipe will take those and put them in the appropriate places. And then the rest of the recipes will configure Tomcat to use SSL. That's an example. And to go beyond that, it's not just data for these variable things, but it's functionality. So if I say I want Artifactory standalone instance, that's the default. If I want high availability, I override that. I override that in kitchen. I can just modify the kitchen YAML. If I want to do that in production or staging, I just set the environment, the attribute in the environment that gets stored in Chef. If we want, we can show you some of those, what they look like, but it's not too complex. So here, I just kind of explained some of the similar things that I've gone through. So the actual installation, what do I do? These are attributes as well, defined as attributes. Where do I get the RPM from? There's a resource called yum repository. It actually turns out to be a template file that I plug in with the attribute where I'm getting that from. This demo, it actually goes to JFrog's bin tray to get Artifactory, at least the initial one here. And then the yum package will actually install the RPM. And as I mentioned, the resource file I use to load licenses as well. So those happen to be a data bag in my Git repo. Those don't get checked into Git because we don't want secrets in Git. So they're ignored when I check in my code. In Chef, there's a knife command that will actually load this into the Chef vault on the server. So when the converge happens and the run list runs, it will go to Chef, get the decrypted license and place it on where it needs to be for Artifactory to pick up and run. As well as any other secrets like the SSL certificates and stuff. So other things that I've templatized is the DB properties file that basically tells you what your database is. Is it MySQL? If it's MySQL, what's the URI that's used to talk to it? I believe there's also secrets in there. Those, again, I get from Chef Vault and plug it in. So when my recipe runs, at the end of that, the DB properties is what we want it to be. In this example, I just leave it to the default. The default is the Derby in-memory database. So I also do the Artifactory system properties, the cluster properties if you're doing high availability, and the HA nodes properties. If I'm doing a high availability, our high availability uses NFS. My recipes, knowing that this high availability, I do the NFS mounts, all that sort of stuff is done by the recipe. One of the things that I found I needed to do is modify existing XML files. So I found a chef supermarket cookbook called XML_file. It allows me to insert or remove or modify elements within an XML file. I needed to enhance that to do some of the things I did, and I submitted that back to the supermarket, and that's been accepted. I use XML file to also do the plugin stuff. Again, the logback.xml and the Tomcat stuff. So HA, there's additional stuff that needs to be done. I'm going to kind of gloss over some of this. You can look at it at your leisure. And let's get to the demo, because I'm sure everyone's interested in seeing that. So the test kitchen environment, again, uses Vagrant. So I installed Vagrant and VirtualBox on my laptop. I needed a license, so I took my Yahoo licenses that I had to do this, and needed JDK, so I went out to Oracle, got the JDK RPM, and some other RPMs. I went and got the JFrog. So the demo, what it's going to be is I have a standalone Artifactory VM that will be serving another virtual machine that I'm running. I wanted to do that so I'm not going out to the internet a lot and pulling these large things during the demo. And to facilitate showing the Chef supermarket support, my setup will also create some repos on my standalone instance for Chef, and I'll show that in just a second. Let's see. Let's just take a look at it. So I pre-did this just before this started. So I ran my recipe that created this Artifactory instance, created some repos, and uploaded some RPMs to it. So let's bring it up. So this is the instance I created. Let me see if I can make that a little bit bigger. Is that okay? So what I did is I created these repos. I created an Artifactory Pro repo with 2 different versions because I wanted to show how I can upgrade. I created the Chef local, which is empty at the moment. I have a Chef remote, which there's nothing there at the moment, and a virtual, which is a combination of the local and the remote. So this was pre-set up. Actually, it only took about 4 or 5 minutes to set up. But let's see if I want to show anything else here. So this is one of the recipes that I have in my cookbook. It's an example Artifactory source recipe. And what it does is it'll install the JDK, install Artifactory, create the repos that I mentioned here, upload those RPMs, and that's what I just showed you. So this is what the kitchen YAML looks like. It looks like it didn't get formatted the best, but basically, and this is just, I believe, a snippet because there's a section above that says a few other things. But basically, this VM is a 1.5 gig virtual machine with 1 CPU. It's private network. You saw the IP on the browser window. And then the recipe that I'm running is this one that I just explained that installs Artifactory, creates the repos, and uploads the stuff. And I had one attribute I needed to override because the default is empty. I had to tell where the Oracle JDK gets installed at. So I defined that attribute. So all that gets set up before the recipe runs. So I have the sourcing virtual machine. So now I've got another cookbook, and I got a recipe that is going to use that sourcing Artifactory to get its stuff. And this one, the kitchen name is LilyPad, and it's going to install this using this recipe demo Artifactory. And I'll show you the contents of that. It's basically simply Artifactory install, Artifactory start. The key point is in this Chef recipe, I have to identify where I'm getting my sources from. And this is again, in the Burks file, you see I'm pointing to my other virtual machine. So it's going to be getting the RPM for Artifactory from there. It's going to be getting the chef cookbook from there. And that's the source of everything here. Some more things that I had to do for this one is, again, I had to give it a different license. I specify the version of Artifactory I want. These are the things that get plugged in there. So when the recipe runs to get the RPM, it goes to my instance on 33.33.33.33. And just to add things up, I go out and install a couple plugins that are out there. How I get the plugins, I actually just go to the Git repo and curl it down. Put it in a location, my recipe, I tell it where to get it. It puts in the proper place. For standalone, it's in one location. If it's a high availability, it goes into a different one. So that. So let's continue on with this demo. So what I want to do is I want to take my cookbook, the one that did the sourcing, and that was one of the recipes and all that. I'm going to publish that to the chef supermarket here. And that's an enhancement Artifactory put out. It's called Knife Artifactory, and I just tell it what cookbook I want, and it's already pointing to my server, and so it's going to send that over there, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. And just so we can see what's going on, we'll log into my sourcing instance, and now we can tail and see what's going on. As you just saw, a line came in. I'm deploying my Frogger cookbook, and so that means it's done. So that's cool. So now if we go back to the browser and I reload it, now you see under local, I just published my cookbook there. And you'll see that it also comes under the virtual, because the virtual is a combination of the local and the remote. So that's cool. So now, if I run my other recipe or other cookbook in a different location, just let me grab that. So that's in a different cookbook. We'll switch to it. And so now it's going to do the kitchen converge, bringing this virtual machine in compliance to what the definition is, and running the recipe, which will install Artifactory. So if we go over here, as I'm tailing the log here, what you should see is that the RPM for Artifactory is served by my sourcing instance. You'll see that my cookbook that I wanted, and it came through already. I downloaded, if you see the download, I don't know if you can see my cursor, the download. So that is being downloaded from my sourcing to this new cookbook already. And then just to show you, I use this external one, the XML_file. That one I don't have locally. That one, it went out to the remote chef that I configured, which goes to the real supermarket. So actually, if I go over here again, now you'll see under the virtual is the XML, and it's not under the local, but it was under the remote. So now we have my cookbook there. And I don't know if you've seen this stuff before with the chef cookbook support, but you can actually drill down and look at I can't do it under virtual, under here. You can actually take a look at the contents of the TGZ that gets created. So you can see that there's the recipes I was talking about. Here's the example Artifactory, the sourcing one that created my sourcing instance. The one I'm running now is this one. And in a few minutes, I'll show you running mission control. So did we finish up here? Looks like it's starting it up. It's already loaded the RPM, it's configured it, and it's doing the start. So that one comes in on this guy. So when it's done, I'll bring up another instance, or another, I'll show you on the browser. And I could show you too, but if I run this recipe a second time, nothing will actually occur. Everything's in compliance on the node with what's in the definitions on the chef setup, so it just won't do anything. That's the idempotence concept. Should only take another minute or so. Any questions at this point? Okay, looks like it's up. And here's my new instance of Artifactory. Okay, since I'm running short on time, I'm going to kick this next thing off. So this is another recipe I have that will install in another virtual machine. So I'll have 3 virtual machines running on my box. It'll install mission control, and then after it's done installing mission control, it will add the 2 instances of Artifactory into mission control, my sourcing one and then the one I just created. So this one takes a little bit more time. So let's see. The other thing I could show you, but it looks like I'm running out of time. The version here you see is a little out of date. For me, it's just an attribute. I change one line in the attribute file and then rerun the convergence. It'll go out and get the new, you'll notice that it's not the same. It'll go out and get the new RPM. It'll download the RPM and install it. And at the end, you have your updated version. Again, I guess we can, while this is running, anyone have a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Can you play the same recipe for upgrading the version, but then without disrupting the data set?
I can show you that, sure. Actually, this one is swampUP. So normally I would change the recipe, but I can change it in the kitchen as well. In kitchen, I would have to add that attribute because I don't think I have it there. Let me see. This one might be hard for you all to see. It's hard for me to see. So this is the new instance I created, and here's the version number. So I just replaced this. I would normally save it, right, and then I'd commit it to Git, create a PR, someone reviews it, it gets merged, and then it'll automatically kick off the pipeline that will run it. Let's see, where am I at? Okay, so it's stirring up mission control. This one takes a couple minutes, and then it will add the instances. Any more questions while we're waiting for this? Yes?
But when you upgrade the instance and change this line, how to migrate the data from the old version to the newer version?
What old data are you referring to?
The existing data in the 5.1 version.
Well, that would be in your database, right? So the database doesn't get affected. You still, all the metadata, all the artifacts, it's all stored in the database. And it has nothing to do with Artifactory code that gets upgraded here.
Some of the artifacts are not as developed in the database. Maybe they are stored in the local VM.
In what way? Like Derby? You talked about using the Derby or something, or? Well, anything local, it wouldn't be changed. The RPM is going to just lay out the executables as it is. It shouldn't wipe out anything. We use MySQL, so you know, everything, we've had no problem. We've been using this for like a year and a half. And I do a little bit more checking than just changing the version number. I kind of go back and look to see if any schema changes result in this as we deploy it to our test instance or our staging. If there's a database upgrade, I want to be a little bit more careful about things. I may want to take a snapshot of the database or something in case something went wrong, that sort of thing. While I'm talk about that here, it looks like mission control came up and it's starting to load the instances. I did want to show you that, so. Oops, don't know what happened there. Oh, copied the wrong line. Sorry. So here's mission control up in my third virtual machine here. I'm just using the default user ID. And here's my two instances. This was my sourcing instance. It's got this little X here because it's a Pro license and not a HA license. This one is an HA license, not configured for HA, but it's there. You can see it describes the license, the enterprise license. You can find out what repositories exist there. This one I didn't add anything to, but if I go back to this one, the sourcing one, here's my repositories I created. So you can now use mission control to manage your instances. So this was just through some simple recipe stuff to install these different entities here. My intent is, and I've set it up, although I haven't fully worked it through, that I could set up another virtual machine with MySQL instance, HA, have 2 nodes connect to it. I can do it all in a kitchen environment, as long as your laptop has enough resources for it, memory-wise and CPU-wise. But here I've got 3 running, and it's been okay. So that's pretty much the demo. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank JFrog for having me, and I hope you got something out of it. And if you're interested, we can hook up and talk about some more stuff. So thank you.